There was an unsettling sentence, almost misaligned with the rest of the official records from 1897, filed in the old Courthouse of Briarstone County, on the northern edge of the Blue Ridge mountain region. Whoever wrote it did not sign it, did not date it, and did not follow the calligraphic standard of the clerks of the time. It was just a short line, as if it had been jotted down in haste, perhaps by the weak light of a kerosene lamp. 46 hunters left at dawn. Only the horses came back. Before delving into the case, the narrator, a researcher revisiting these files more than a century later, makes an almost imperceptible pause and adds a small note to the viewer that, before continuing, they should write in the comments from which city they are watching and what time it is now, because stories like this gain a different kind of weight when we notice where on the map and in time each person is listening to them. From there, the narrative returns to the year 1897, when the Blue Ridge region was still a cluster of scattered villages among cold clearings, dense forests, and winding dirt roads. The late 19th century landscape had a silence of its own, a silence that seemed to absorb conversations, footsteps, and rumors with the same ease with which the fog swallowed the treetops shortly after sunrise. Red Hollow, a small community on the western side of the boundary, was made up of just over 40 wooden houses, a small general store, a Methodist church, and a communal barn where farmers stored their surplus harvest. It was a village of simple people, marked by long winters, short summers, and an economy that depended on hunting, bartering, and small crops. There, stories passed from generation to generation around campfires, but rarely became official documents. That is why the existence of that stray line in the records, the one about the 46 hunters, was in itself disturbing. Among the oldest surnames in the region were the Red Hollow sisters, known only as Ada and Marlene, two women who had inherited the family property, a narrow, dark wood house and a low-ceilinged loft, used for years to dry hides and store hunting products. The wooden loft, called by the community the binding loft due to the meticulous work of sewing, tying, and curing skins, stood at the highest point of the property, facing the edge of the forest. According to the records, Ada Red Hollow was 32 years old in 1897. She was a reserved figure of few words, who usually avoided the village center, preferring to handle her trades and orders directly at the store, always in the early hours of the morning. Her sister Marlene, 3 years older, was the opposite, talkative, cordial, known for the red scarves she sewed and sold to the hunters' wives before the season began. Despite their differences, the two were seen as hard-working, disciplined women, entirely devoted to the property, a common behavior in families who had lost their parents early and needed to keep the land on their own. The hunters who lived in and passed through the region knew the sisters' property well, not because of any negative reputation, but because Ada and Marlene's house stood at a mandatory crossing point for those heading to the hunting plateaus. Almost all the groups passed along the narrow road that bordered the land, a stretch the snow tended to cover first, making the walk difficult but unavoidable. It was a mute, familiar place, almost ordinary. It was in this setting that the protagonist of this account appeared, Elias Hargrove, a 44-year-old hunter, a veteran of the Blue Ridge Hills, with a pragmatic temperament and known for his rigid attention to detail. Testimonies record that he was respected, though not exactly liked. The kind of man who spoke little, observed much, and rarely drank with the others in the late afternoons. He had been a widower since 1893 and had a teenage daughter, Clara, who lived with an aunt in the neighboring village of Whitlow Creek. His bond with the girl was strong, though marked by long periods of absence due to the hunting expeditions. On November 2nd, 1897, Elias led the largest group recorded in that decade, 46 men, among them seasoned veterans and young men who were trying for the first time to prove their skill in the hills. They left shortly before dawn, when the line between night and morning still wavered between deep blue and the gray of the thick fog that filled the valley. They left behind horses, wagons, and belongings, planning to return in 3 days. Enough time to hunt, prepare the hides, and begin transporting the first loads back. But they did not return. What came back, in the late afternoon of the fourth day, were only the horses, still with their harnesses, still bearing the marks of recent departure, but without signs of battle, fall, or flight. A sight that, according to the local reverend's accounts, made the entire village stop breathing for a few seconds. In the documents preserved in the county archive, there is a marginal note about that day. It said that the animals arrived in silence, uninjured, walking in a line, as if they had been led to the last bend in the road, and then released. And there is an even more disturbing detail, the one that closes this first block. The handwriting of the sentence about the 46 hunters is the same as that of another, much older document that mentioned the Red Hollow sisters, a document that, officially, should not exist. And it is precisely the presence of this repeated handwriting, separated by decades and outside any logical context, that inaugurates the mystery of this story, a mystery the researcher-narrator will try to reconstruct from the gaps left by time. To understand the weight of the disappearance of the 46 hunters, it is necessary to go back a few months before November 1897, when Red Hollow was still described in church reports as a slow-paced community marked by daily effort and by a silence that was more economical than sad. Mornings almost always began the same way. The metallic sound of buckets at the communal well, the creaking of wagon wheels, the dry noise of axes splitting firewood. Women walked by in thick aprons and heavy boots. Boys ran barefoot along the dirt road, and the smell of smoke mixed with damp earth was part of the routine, especially in the months leading up to winter. There was no haste, but there was urgency. Each day had to justify the food for the next. The hunters occupied a particular place in this silent machinery. They were described in minutes from the time as men with trained eyes and measured steps, responsible for supplying not only Red Hollow, but also neighboring villages with meat, leather, and pelts that would be sold or traded for flour, kerosene, nails, cloth. Among them, Elias Hargrove stood out not for charisma, but for predictability. The testimonies collected years later repeat the same adjective. He was a decent man, wrote an old shopkeeper, already elderly, in a letter from 1941. I never saw him embrace anyone, but I also never saw him break his word. Elias lived in a small house away from the center, in a higher area, from where it was possible to see in the distance the dark line of the Blue Ridge Forest. His daily routine, reconstructed from records and oral accounts, followed an almost mathematical pattern. He woke before sunrise, made his own coffee, checked his notes in a hardcover notebook, where he marked dates, destinations, and a sort of personal bookkeeping, and then went down to the store to check messages, orders, and any news about the weather in the hills. His most sensitive bond was with his daughter, Clara. The letters she wrote years later, preserved in part by an aunt and donated to a small regional archive, describe a father not prone to displays of affection, but attentive to details almost no one else noticed. He adjusted the laces on the girl's boots, checked if the windows were well closed, asked about persistent headaches, and watched in silence when she spent longer than usual staring at the empty road. He looked at things as if he were measuring the distance between what had already happened and what could still happen. Clara wrote in 1923, in that same period, the sisters Ada and Marlene Red Hollow maintained a routine that, to outside eyes, bordered on rigid. They woke early, lit the fire, checked the smaller traps near the property, and then went up to the loft, the binding loft, with baskets of leather and cloth. From up there, it was possible to see a good stretch of the road leading to the plateaus. Some witnesses, decades later, would remember them as two figures cut out against the filtered light slipping through the wooden slats of the roof, always working with their hands, busy in stitches, cuts, and knots. The sisters' activity was considered necessary for the local economy. They bought part of the hunters' pelts, treated the leather, repaired harnesses, belts, and bags, and returned the material ready for use or sale. They were not officially part of the hunting groups, but their work accompanied every expedition, mending what the forest tore. Some records, however, note small oddities. In a deposition taken in 1910, a former hunter, then already frail, mentions that Ada kept her own notebook, where she wrote down the names of the men who left on each major expedition, the date, and the type of leather they usually brought back. It was not a formal inventory. It was a personal list, written in handwriting more careful than what was needed for simple sales and accounts. This detail by itself would not draw much attention. However, in a marginal note found beside a receipt from 1895, someone, possibly the same clerk who would later write the sentence about the 46 hunters, wrote, "Ada asked to confirm the names more than once. She said it was so she wouldn't get the bindings wrong." No one was able to explain precisely what that meant. In the village's daily life, the sisters were seen as discreet, but not hostile. Marlene kept a sort of small ritual with some of the younger hunters. Before they set out, she offered red scarves or dark strips of cloth for them to tie around their wrists, hats, or harnesses. She said it was to remember the way back. Many accepted out of courtesy, others out of superstition, and others still out of sheer lack of anything else to say. Elias, according to testimonies, rarely accepted any additional adornment. But in the weeks before the 1897 expedition, at least 2 people claimed to have seen the red scarf folded inside his saddlebag, alongside the ammunition. He never commented on it. The weather in the region that autumn was also recorded differently from usual. Church reports and farmers' notes mention an unusually dry start to the season, with clear days and colder nights than expected. The forest, they say, seemed sharper in the distance, as if the trees had come a little closer. There is nothing supernatural in this, but there is something in the way people describe the wind and light that year that suggests a certain discomfort that is hard to put into words. There were also small incidents that, at the time, were treated as isolated strokes of bad luck. A horse that refused to cross a specific point in the road, tossing its head and backing up until it nearly threw its rider. 2 hunters who lost their sense of direction under a clear sky, insisting they had walked in a straight line until they realized they had come back to the same stone marker, and a sequence of dry cracks in the woods heard at night, with nobody finding any animal or broken branch large enough to match the sound they recognized. These episodes were recorded in a scattered way, in personal diaries, letters, and later accounts. They would only take on a clearer outline when the researcher, decades later, began to cross-reference dates, places, and names. On a more intimate level, the period before the Great November expedition was decisive for Elias and his daughter. A few days before departure, he traveled to Whitlow Creek to see Clara. It was a short visit, but striking enough that she, as an adult, would describe that afternoon as heavier than the winter sky. They spoke little. He asked about the girl's health, about her classes at the small community school, about her relationship with her aunt. At a specific moment, according to the letter she wrote years later, he held her wrist with unexpected firmness and simply said, "If you hear someone saying they haven't seen me come back, wait for the notebooks, not for the rumors." Clara never fully understood what her father meant by that, but she kept the sentence. Meanwhile, in Red Hollow, preparations for the expedition went on with a mix of routine and quiet expectation. It was the largest departure in years, and many saw in it a chance to rebuild stocks and settle debts with the store. Families helped prepare provisions: harder bread, salted meat, coffee, tobacco. Wives sewed small cloth pouches, reinforcing the seams as if, with that, they could also stitch the men to the promise of return. The Red Hollow sisters in this context assumed their usual role, but with nuances that would only be noticed later. Ada made at least 2 trips to the store to confirm the final list of participants. Marlene, in turn, spent more time than usual on the house's porch, watching the road. A neighbor, decades later, recounted that he once saw her staring fixedly at the highest part of the forest, murmuring something he could not hear. When she realized she was being watched, she simply smiled and went back inside. On the eve of departure, the binding loft stayed lit later than usual. A farmer who passed by on the road on his way back from a more distant field noted in his diary that the upper windows of the sisters' house showed a more yellowish, stronger light than usual. and that it was possible to see shadows cast on the inner walls, moving over and over, as if someone were measuring, cutting, and tying something with stubborn rhythm. He did not stop to ask. In Red Hollow, no one interrupted people who were working. That was an unspoken rule. On the morning of the expedition, the air was cold and clear. The 46 men gathered in the open area in front of the store, adjusting harnesses, checking weapons, laughing loudly in some corners, and maintaining a more focused silence in others. Elias moved among the groups, checking the smallest details: the way the ropes were tied, the amount of ammunition, the condition of the boots. He seemed more tense than usual, according to at least 3 witnesses. The sisters appeared shortly before departure. Marlene, with a basket of scarves and strips of cloth. Ada, with a closed notebook under her arm. She walked up to the shopkeeper responsible for recording purchases, asked for the final list, and, without saying a word, checked name by name, crossing out some details with a fine pen. One of the young hunters, excited, later stated in his deposition that it was one of the most beautiful days of the year. Another, older, described a different impression. He said the sky was too clear, as if something were missing on the horizon. The men, mounted, lined up in smaller groups and one by one passed along the stretch of road that bordered the Red Hollow property. The sisters stood there, watching the procession of men and animals crossing the line between village and forest. Marlene would raise her arm now and then, waving. Ada kept her eyes on the notebook, lifting them only to confirm faces and names. No one was ever able to say for sure whether Elias accepted the red scarf that day. What is known is that the final record from that morning notes that he was the last of the group to cross the point where the road bends toward the forest. And, according to a solitary, almost forgotten account from a woman who was washing clothes at the nearby creek, it was not the men's voices she heard when the group disappeared from view. She swore, years later, that what echoed in the distance was the sound of a heavy object dragging over wood, as if someone were closing with effort an old door at the top of a loft. The last confirmed record of the 46 hunters before the disappearance was written in the diary of a farmer from Whitlow Creek. He claimed to have seen, in the distance, the silhouettes of the men moving toward the northern edge of the plateaus shortly before sunset. The late afternoon light was described as cut, with long strips of shadow stretching between the trees, as if the forest were trying to pull the night into itself earlier than it should. From that point on, what is known about the expedition was reconstructed through scattered traces: a canteen found near a flat rock, a partially extinguished campfire, boot prints in the thin mud, and a piece of leather cut with precision. Fragments that, by themselves, do not say much, but which, when aligned chronologically, suggest a silent and unsettling narrative. Later accounts, gathered between 1905 and 1940, described that the group had set up an intermediate camp about 4 hours after leaving Red Hollow. The exact location was never found with total certainty, but traces point to a narrow clearing, surrounded by rocky edges and possibly used by hunters since the 1870s. There, the fires usually burned only briefly, just enough to heat water, dry damp boots, and ward off small predators. It was a common, almost automatic stage. However, something that night seems to have broken with the pattern. According to a late testimony, recorded almost 40 years later by a retired doctor who interviewed indirect survivors from the village, one of the men supposedly heard unusual sounds in the forest even before dark. Not roars, not heavy footsteps, but a sound of wood against wood, like regular distant knocks that echoed with an almost methodical rhythm. He described it as insistent blows, unhurried, as if someone were closing or reinforcing some structure. No one was able to confirm the account, since none of the hunters returned. But those sounds coincided with another unsettling detail mentioned in diaries from local residents. That same night, several inhabitants of Red Hollow reported hearing wind passing through the slats of the binding loft, even when the air outside was still. One isolated account says the loft light stayed on past midnight. As the sky darkened in the forest, the temperature dropped faster than usual. Meteorological records from the time, scarce but enough, show an abrupt drop, unusual for that phase of autumn. The lack of clouds made the light colder, sharper, creating a faint clarity that cast long shadows across the uneven ground. The hunter's fire would have been built at the center of the clearing, shielded by 3 fallen logs. They prepared coffee, roasted a small portion of meat, and arranged their belongings around the light. It was a ritual repeated so many times that it could hardly have caused any collective tension. But, as some indirect accounts suggest, Elias Hargrove was restless that night. A testimony preserved in a notebook kept by the old Red Hollow Reverend, who, by habit, wrote about unusual behaviors among the population, states that one of the young hunters had seen Elias walking alone along the edge of the clearing, as if looking for something among the trees. He allegedly stopped at a specific point, placed his hand on the fabric of his saddlebag, and remained still for almost a minute, staring into the darkness. This detail would only gain significance decades later, when the researcher, the same one who conducts the narrative, compared the position of this point with an old note made by Ada Red Hollow in her private notebook. A small X marked in the upper corner of the page, accompanied by the phrase "curve of the wind." The relationship between these two pieces of information is still a subject of debate among regional historians. What is known with greater certainty is that, at some point during that night, the hunters heard a sound that made them stop their conversations. Not a roar, not a common crack of the woods, but something described many years later as a deep dragging, as if something heavy were being moved over old wooden boards. It was a sound impossible to explain in that environment, given that there were no human constructions there. The group would have fallen silent immediately. Some drew closer to the fire, others reached for their weapons. Elias, according to reconstructions made from the imagination of those who knew him, kept his eyes fixed on the same point in the forest he had observed before. The shadows between the trees were dense, but not entirely dark. A pale glow, filtered by the moon, cut the space between trunks, making only the outline of still shapes visible. It was in this interval that something changed in the men's expressions. Some claimed they heard footsteps, light, rhythmic, as if someone were walking on a very well-fitted wooden surface, but that detail was never confirmed. Others claimed to have seen, among the shadows, something like a strip of fabric slowly fluttering, without enough wind to move it. The red scarf, perhaps. It is impossible to know. There are no reports of an attack. There are no signs of struggle. There are no marks of a desperate escape. When the clearing was found weeks later, there were only traces of the camp. Boots aligned as if they had been left in a hurry, scattered utensils, a campfire reduced to cold ashes, and shallow marks in the soil made by ropes that had been stretched and then removed. And there was, near a moss-covered rock, a single object preserved with disconcerting clarity, a strip of leather tied in an intricate manner, with knots identical to those the Red Hollow sisters used in the binding loft. This trace did not seem to have gone through the same weathering as the other objects. It was dry, clean, and partially sheltered by a jut in the rock, as if someone had placed it there not as a loss, but as a sign, or a mark. The most enigmatic detail, however, came from a group of loggers who were traveling along the road bordering the sisters' property on the morning after the disappearance. They reported in a signed document that they saw the 46 men's horses running toward the main road, but they did not seem disorganized or panicked. They moved in a line, as if being guided to a specific point, and shortly after that, one of the loggers claimed to have seen something at the top of the Red Hollow's loft, a shadow cast against the window, moving from side to side as if someone were walking slowly inside. But the binding loft was locked from the inside that day. When the local authorities finally opened the loft, 3 days later, they found only tools, stretched skins, strips of leather, and tying marks on the beams. Nothing unusual at first glance, nothing that would justify any formal suspicion. Nothing, except Ada Red Hollow's notebook, which lay open on the uneven wooden table. On the center page there was a list of names, 46 names. all marked with the same firm, continuous diagonal stroke, as if crossing out something that had been completed. The last mark was unfinished, as if the hand had been interrupted mid-gesture, and, at the bottom margin of the page, almost imperceptible in the dim loft light, there was a sentence written in ink darker than the rest. "The curve of the wind does not give back what it takes." It was the last known piece of evidence before the case sank into silence for decades. The news of the disappearance spread through Red Hollow like a sudden change in the weather. There were no screams, no running, no uproar. The first feeling recorded in the testimonies, almost unanimously, was that of a heavy, dense silence, as if the whole village had taken a long breath and found no air to release it. Families gathered at the store where the Reverend, the shopkeeper, and two older men tried with difficulty to organize a search that made sense. It was hard, however, to form groups that were not personally connected to at least one of the missing. Relatives, friends, neighbors, everyone had ties to at least one of the 46 men. This meant the first search parties were hastily formed, made up of people who left with rigid expressions, carrying weapons, lanterns, and an anxiety that the records describe as feverish. The Red Hollow sisters' property was the first stopping point. The authorities wanted to understand whether the horses had truly come from that direction, or if the road's proximity had created that illusion. Ada and Marlene received the group with their characteristic composure. Ada stood upright by the door, hands folded. Marlene spoke more, answered questions, explained that they had not seen any unusual movement that morning, that the loft light had stayed on because they had worked late treating some hides. The binding loft was inspected twice. First, by two men from the village. Later, by a smaller team led by the Reverend. Both groups reported the same impression. Nothing seemed out of place, but there was something about the way the beams were marked that unsettled them. They were scratches, superficial cuts, and improvised seals with smaller ropes, common signs in a workspace, but which, in that context, took on a strange weight. Ada's notebook, found open, was examined under the unsteady light of a lantern. No one commented aloud on the crossed-out list of names. The firm, methodical handwriting seemed out of step with the lighter script women typically used for household accounts at the time. It was as if each name had been marked not as a confirmation, but as a conclusion. Even so, there was no proof implicating anyone. The sisters were questioned, but not formally accused. One of the testimonies mentions that Ada supposedly said only, "You are looking for men who may not have been taken by the woods, but by the path they chose themselves." That ambiguous, enigmatic sentence would be repeated for decades, gaining different interpretations as time went on. The searches stretched across the plateaus, along the edges of the valley, on old trails, and through poorly charted areas. Groups went in and out of the forest with reddened eyes and faces marked by wind. Some brought back isolated objects, a glass bottle, an irregular strip of leather, a button ripped from a shirt. Nothing, however, that indicated a fight, blood, or chaotic flight. The only significant discovery was the location of the intermediate camp. The clearing showed signs of an abrupt departure, but not of violence. The boots left almost in rows suggested that the men had removed part of their gear before moving to another point, whether voluntarily or not. The shallow marks in the ground, made by taut ropes, drew attention. They looked like technical lashings. Well done, similar to those Ada and Marlene taught in their informal leather repair sessions. That detail, however, never rose above speculation. The absence of definitive clues generated growing emotional tension in the community. Wives and mothers alternated periods of hope with long stretches of catatonic silence. Children asked about their fathers with a calmness that, in the records, was described as stunning. There were meals no one managed to finish. There were nights when lanterns stayed lit until dawn out of sheer inability to accept the dark. The Reverend, in his diary, now widely cited, wrote, "If there were blood, faith would adjust. But the emptiness, that is what tears the soul." Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate among the older men. One said he had seen expeditions partially disappear in previous years, though never in such large numbers. Another said that certain forest paths changed with the wind, not physically, but in the hunter's perception, as if bends once familiar became strangely long or too quiet. These reports were not supernatural. They were human interpretations of fear, fatigue, and loneliness in hostile environments. A more pragmatic hypothesis arose among some residents, that the group had split after an internal disagreement or in the face of unexpected difficulties. But that theory did not explain the coordinated return of the horses, nor the lack of any concrete trace indicating dispersal. The hardest, and perhaps most plausible, revelation came from the reconstruction the researcher would make decades later, analyzing simultaneously Elias's notebooks, the sisters' lists, and the fragmented search reports. He noticed a pattern in the dates of previous expeditions. In all of them, large groups had returned with at least one significant incident involving disorientation, loss of supplies, or internal conflict. Nothing that had become serious before, but enough to suggest that over the years there had been a growing tension between veteran hunters and inexperienced young men. The researcher raised a quiet hypothesis. What if part of the group, already tense and divided, had made a hasty decision on that cold plateau night? Perhaps they followed the wrong trail. Perhaps they tried to cut through an unstable area. Perhaps an argument got out of control. Perhaps a succession of small, wrong choices, combined with intense cold, accumulated fatigue, and lack of experience, led the group too far from camp, into a deep valley, a narrow corridor between rocks, a dead-end area. This kind of human error, repeated under extreme conditions, could explain the disappearance without the need for any extraordinary event. That hypothesis does not exclude the Red Hollow sisters' role, not as culprits, but as privileged observers. It is possible they had noticed before everyone else the fragility of that particular group. The records suggest that Ada noticed tensions no one else wrote down. Marlene knew the hunters' temperaments, their fears, their impulses. Perhaps Ada's notebook was only that, a meticulous observation, an attempt to understand behavioral patterns, an unofficial record of who left emotionally fit and who was not prepared. And by crossing out the names, she was not marking deaths. She was marking her own silent prediction that that group would hardly return. Society at the time did not know how to handle predictions, and women who noticed too much were often misread. The bitterest revelation, however, came from Elias Hargrove's notebook. Between the pages, kept as if it were a reminder to himself, there was a folded note, the red scarf he had never admitted to carrying. Next to it, he had written, "To remember the way back, even when the mind does not want to." The researcher interpreted this sentence as Elias's recognition that the region, that year, was more dangerous, not because of external forces, but because of human behavior itself. The emotional wear of the men, the unpredictability of decisions made at the limit of cold and exhaustion. In the end, the possible revelation was not a solution, but an understanding. The 46 hunters did not vanish because of something that came from outside. They disappeared because all the human signs were there, and no one knew how to read them in time. The Reverend's final note summarizes this feeling. The forest did not swallow 46 men. What took them was what they carried within themselves. When the researcher finally sat down at the narrow table in the regional archive, more than 100 years had passed since the disappearance of the 46 hunters. The paper smelled of old dust and weakening glue, the book covers bowed outward, and the margins of the documents held not only annotations, but also the invisible weight of the hands that had handled them before him. He spread out on the wood everything he had managed to gather: copies of Clara Hargrove's letters, the Reverend's minutes, the farmer from Whitlow Creek's diary, fragments of the logger's depositions, loose pages from Ada Red Hollow's notebook. Around him, the silence of the room felt like a natural extension of Red Hollow's silence, as if the village and the archive were merely two rooms in the same house. Outside, the contemporary city went on with its modern noise, engines, hurried conversations, distant announcements. But in there, time seemed to have chosen to move more slowly. The light entering through the high window drew dusty streaks in the air, recalling in some way the pale brightness the old accounts described over the Blue Ridge Plateaus. The researcher knew he would not find a single answer. There was no map, confession, body, or official record that could fill all the gaps. What existed was something more uncomfortable, a set of human gestures, silent choices, and small oversights that, when added together, formed a kind of invisible chain, pulling those men beyond the village's reach. He went back to the starting point, the stray sentence in the 1897 file. 46 hunters left at dawn. Only the horses came back. Beside it, in another folder, lay Ada's remark, "The curve of the wind does not give back what it takes." Between these two sentences stretched more than a century of attempts to understand, blame, justify. There were those who said the forest was cursed. There were those who swore the Red Hollow sisters knew more than they admitted. There were those who blamed the recklessness of the young, the rigidity of the veterans, the unstable weather, the treacherous geography. Over time, however, what remained were not the theories but the absences. Families had to learn to live with empty chairs at the table, coats hanging that no one else would wear, tools that lost their purpose without the hands that once wielded them. Clara Hargrove, for instance, grew up between two contradictory certainties: that her father would not return, and that every time the wind passed through the windows, someone was still looking for him inside her memory. Years later, as an adult, she returned some of her father's notebooks to the Reverend, asking that they be kept with the county documents, so that no one says he got lost through carelessness. She wrote in the letter that accompanied the donation. The researcher found that envelope at the bottom of a cardboard box, covered in dust, and wrote on the spine, "Hargrove, not to forget." The Red Hollow sisters, in turn, disappeared in another way, not into the forest, but from the narrative. They remained in the house for a few more years, then moved away. At least that is what 2 land transfer records and a vague note in a tithe ledger suggest. They left no confessions, no letters, no will that explained Ada's notebook or the insistent work in the loft. The binding loft eventually lost its original function. As the decades passed, the roof slowly gave way. The slats were torn out by time and by hands looking for cheap wood. What had once been a space of meticulous work became just a hollow structure, seen from afar as a dark cutout atop an abandoned house. In one of the accounts collected by the researcher, a man who visited the region in the 1960s described climbing up to the old loft. He found only dust, rusty nails, a scrap of dried fabric, and marks of old knots on the beams. He said that when he ran his hand over one of them, he felt as if he were touching more than wood, as if he were handling a memory that did not belong to him. He did not report any supernatural chill, no whispered voices, no visions, only an uncomfortable feeling that there, in that room, many silent decisions had been observed without ever being spoken aloud. The researcher then returned to the central question: what really disappears when people vanish? The bodies, certainly. The voices, the steps on the road, the routines at the dinner table. But little by little, what dissolves most cruelly are the details. The way someone folds a scarf, the way they measure the distance between the house and the forest line, the way they hold a metal mug when hearing difficult news. If these fragments are not recorded, they are not lost because time is cruel, but because the living must go on. Leafing through the last pages, he realized that the story of the 46 hunters was less about a great, mysterious tragedy and more about the sum of small, ignored signs. Tired men who kept going without questioning their own limits. Women who perceived tensions and wrote them in the margins of notebooks without being taken seriously. Children who grew up hearing simplified versions of the facts, as if the truth were too complex to fit into a single narrative. Perhaps, the historian thought, the real mystery was not what happened that night on the Blue Ridge Plateaus, but what each person chose not to see before it. The 46 did not vanish, because the forest took them all at once. They drifted away little by little, day after day, decision after decision, an expedition larger than usual, a drier autumn, accumulated fatigue, a gaze that avoided facing conflict, silence in place of a plea for help. By the time they finally rounded the bend in the road, they were already, in many ways, beyond the reach of those who stayed behind. In the final report he wrote on the case, the researcher avoided the word mystery. He preferred another expression, irreparable gap. He noted that although the absence of concrete evidence fueled theories, what really shaped Red Hollow's memory was not the enigma itself, but the trail of interrupted lives and bonds that never had the chance to be resolved. He ended his text with a simple image, that of an empty road, seen from the top of an aged house. There are no horses, no hunters, no figures in the windows, only the wind passing by, tracing what remains of the walls, going down the valley, crossing the same strip of earth that once carried 46 men away. Closing the folder, the researcher felt he had not solved anything, but he had done something that, in its own way, seemed more honest. He had narrowed the gap between the document and the people who had once breathed inside it. He had given back names, context, fragility, and humanity to those who, for decades, had existed only as a number in a single line of a file. And perhaps that is the only fair way to deal with disappearances that will never be fully explained. Not to inflate the mystery, not to invent monsters, not to fill the silence with ghosts, but to accept that, in certain cases, what remains is this uncomfortable combination of gaps, memories, and small forgotten objects. A red scarf, a strip of leather, a sentence in the margin of a book. Some visitors still go to the Blue Ridge region out of curiosity or chance. Sometimes they stop in front of what is left of the sisters' property. Sometimes they walk a little way up the dirt road. Sometimes they just look from afar at the faded outline of the old loft. Few know the whole story. Fewer still know the names of the 46. But when the wind turns the corner of the valley and brushes against the old boards, a specific kind of silence settles. A silence that needs no explanation, answer, or conclusion. Because in the end, some stories do not ask that someone find out what happened. They ask only that someone sit down, open the files, read each name in a low voice, and accept that there are absences we will never learn how to fill. And it is exactly at that point that no matter how much we search, there is nothing left to say.